Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to the webinar. We're delighted to have you join us today for Expat Planning. My name is Ed Burke. I'm Marketing Programs Manager for High Street Partners, and I will be moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few quick housekeeping items. First, questions. Please send us your questions at any time during the broadcast using the questions panel on the right-hand side of the screen. During the broadcast, all attendees will be muted, but we will continuously monitor the questions panel and answer your questions at the end of the broadcast. Second, technical difficulties. If you experience technical difficulties during the broadcast, we suggest that you log out and then return to the webinar, as this typically resolves most connection issues. If you encounter persistent technical difficulties, you can contact GoToWebinar Technical Support. And finally, the recording. This broadcast is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to you within 24 hours via email. Well, that concludes the housekeeping items. Let's get started. Before we review the webinar agenda, I would like to quickly give you some insight on how High Street Partners is positioned to speak as experts on today's subject. High Street Partners is a leader in international business software and services with more than 600 customers supported in over 110 countries. We provide ongoing and one-time solutions for entity planning and implementation, finance and accounting, global payroll, compliance, and HR operations and administration via our integrated cloud-based Overseas Connect platform. Coupled with the expertise of our advisory services teams, HSP has a solution that fits your business's needs. It's my pleasure to introduce Cody Smith, Director of Advisory Services for High Street Partners. Cody brings over 20 years' experience in supporting and advising multinational customers on expat, tax, and payroll matters. Concentrating in the areas of global mobility, HR, tax, immigration, and payroll, Cody brings a broad range of expertise addressing practical issues that arise when setting up and managing overseas operations to the HSP Advisory Services team. Over to you, Cody.
Thank you, Ed. Good morning, everyone. If you're on the western half of the U.S., where I am, otherwise, good afternoon or good evening. As Ed said, I'm Cody Smith, Director in the advisory practice. I'm based in the West Coast in Silicon Valley. It's a pleasure to have you join today. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk about expats. I guess I'm fairly qualified, I think, to talk in this space. I've actually been an expat myself, having worked in London for several years. I had a 3-year assignment in Tokyo, and I've lived in Hong Kong. So when you talk about the trials and some of the pitfalls that come along with that, I've experienced it firsthand as an individual on the receiving side of being an expatriate, but also on the advisory side for as Ed said, over 20 years, consulting and advising my clients around expatriate mobility, immigration, and tax matters. If we look at the agenda today, what we're going to cover, a couple of key questions that I hear come up time and time again when I consult with my customers. We'll talk about assignment policies and overview just some of the definitions and different types of policy arrangements that are out there. We'll touch on immigration and also tax compliance, two definitely key, important, and critical areas of managing mobile and expatriate workforce. We'll talk about tax reimbursement options that are out there, the actual expatriate tax services that are typically provided in both a home and a host location. We'll talk about some of the challenges of expatriate payroll. For those of you that manage payroll or get caught up in that process with your assignees, you'll clearly have some insight into some of the challenges that go along with managing that piece of the workforce. And we'll round that out with just talking about some common mistakes and maybe some practical solutions to tackle some of these expatriate matters that we'll be discussing today. So like I said, we'll start initially with talking about just some key questions that I see come up in my conversations with customers. A lot of this now revolves around just knowing where your assignees are at any given point, as well as your business travelers or business commuters. I think for most organizations, it's fairly easy for them to extract the list out of their HR system or from their global mobility team of people that are on an active expatriate assignment. If someone has left their home country, they've gone on a temporary basis to Hong Kong, let's say, on a 3-year assignment, you know about those people that you have working in Hong Kong and Germany and Japan on a temporary basis. But we're seeing an increase with the tax authorities asking companies to track or be able to produce a list of individuals that may be traveling frequently in and out of a particular jurisdiction. And it's really a lot harder for companies to nail that piece of data down. You can work with travel vendors, line management, education is key. But we'll talk about some issues a bit later in the presentation revolving business travelers and commuters. But that's more frequently becoming an issue, particularly when they trip up into immigration and tax issues, when they go over that typical proverbial 183-day rule that we'll talk about a bit later. Let's get to number 3. Are people obtaining their work permits in advance of taking these business trips or assignments? The days are gone when you can typically fly into a country, tell them you're a tourist or you're just visiting for a short period of time. Governments are wanting to know a bit more about what you're doing and making sure that your immigration is in order and you've got the proper work authorization and entry requirements for the jurisdictions that you're going to enter. How do people manage employee-specific relocations? For a lot of growing and expanding companies, maybe they don't have a policy, they don't have set vendors. This may be more of an ad hoc or management decision on how they're going to relocate and compensate individuals. But as people get to sending more employees, their programs become larger, it does become more important to actually look at having documented policies in place, look at contracting out to specified vendors, and things of that nature. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail. How do you make sure that your employees are not worse off by working overseas? Are there policies that address that? What happens if an employee is better off? There are times they can find themselves in a financial windfall situation. So we want to address how we can tackle that. So if we look at number 6 there on the list, what extra components or benefits of compensation are provided to the individuals? Is that a management directive? Is it uniform across the organization? Is there a policy that dictates this? It can be based on employee grade or salary level, but we'll explore different options on what makes sense to fairly compensate an individual. And again, is there a policy to keep that uniform? We'll talk about policy exceptions, which we like to keep to a minimum. So when there is a policy, we want to hold to that and keep to the policy as much as possible.